So as Mackenzie said, I'm Sierra. I'm a senior developer in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I work for a boutique mobile development firm. And I work on Bluetooth and IoT native Android apps. And tonight I am going to talk about, well, tonight for me, evening, afternoon, wherever you might be, I'm going to talk about accessibility in Android. And so part of Google's mission is to make the world's information universally accessible and useful. So accessibility is actually part of Google's mission. And so it's really exciting to be talking about what they do for developers to make all of our apps accessible. And now more than ever, apps are not only giving us access to a lot of information, but they're also giving us more access and freedom and independence to the rest of the world. So I need to click on this one. I care a lot about making tech and more inclusive and accessible. And so there's really two parts to that. I want to make the tech space itself more inclusive and more accessible to more people, which is why I'm try to be super involved with Women Who Code and other organizations that really promote these kind of missions and use my expertise when it is appropriate. On the other hand, I really want to build more accessible applications with my talents. And tonight we're going to talk about some of the very technical language-specific things that we can do to build accessible apps. But we don't want to stop there when we're thinking about inclusive apps. Accessibility is one part of that, but we also need to think about our content and whether there's a specific demographic or imagery that we're using over and over and the language that we're using in our apps. And so building inclusive apps is a whole ecosystem of things that we can do. And this is just one portion of it. I also think that these two things really go hand in hand together because we had a great opening talk on this, is that when you have more diverse teams, you're going to build better or more diverse products. And so by helping make tech a more accessible place and more inclusive place, you're also going to have the end result of building more accessible and more inclusive products. So for me, building accessible apps comes second nature and something I really want to promote. But I find that it's not always the case with businesses. I feel that it often falls in that same category as unit tests where people are like, I know this is good to have, but where's the time? Where's the bottom line? And so the question is, how do you convince your business that they should also invest time and energy into making their apps more accessible? So the first reason for that is that it's more users, and that's really important in mobile development. 1 in 4 people have some kind of disability, and when there are 2 billion Android users worldwide, that means about 50 million Android users have some kind of disability and want to use your app and maybe can't. It's also risk management. So in the Domino's versus Robes case, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of a blind man who said he could not order pizza off Domino's website or mobile app. And so that was a landmark case in saying that not only do websites need to be accessible, but also mobile apps, and that you can be held financially accountable to make sure that actually happens. Finally, in addition, it's better for everyone. And one of my favorite examples of this is thinking about hashtags, which is a super simple way to make your post online more accessible. When you see just a block of code or a block of text, it's really hard to read for me as a normal person. When we think about how we name our variables in codes, we always use some kind of camel case because it's easier to read. It turns out it's also easier for screen readers to read instead of trying to make that one giant word or figure out from context how to pronounce that string. There are lots of other examples of what can be more, what you take advantage of that is really built in for accessibility purposes. Things like being able to tab through a form on your computer, or the cutouts in sidewalks that make it easier to push a stroller or pull suitcases over the sidewalk when you're going to the airport. And finally, and the one that really just drives it home for me is it's the right thing to do. And so I included 2 quotes from 2 people that I really respect in the DE&I space. Kim Creighton, the anti-racist economist, saying prioritize the most vulnerable. And I think it's really important to build your mobile apps with accessibility in mind so that when it comes time for someone who needs that accommodation to be able to use it, it's already there. And also, Tatiana Mack said compassionate action is better than empathy. And being able to, and adding accessibility and adding these features to your app is an action that you can take that's not particularly hard to make the app more accessible and really in general, just the world a better place. So I wanted to go over a little bit of background before we jump into any kind of code. So the type of disabilities that you can encounter are, there are 4 different types. First is mobile impairments. And so this can range from using a wheelchair to just having really shaky hands. And so there's a whole range for any of these types. Users who experience some kind of motor impairment might use some kind of hardware device to access your app, like an accessibility switch that just lets them touch 2 buttons to navigate and interact, or use the accessibility menu provided by Google to have easier access to common actions. Cognitive impairments, which can range from something like dyslexia to cerebral palsy. And they might use action blocks to set up routines for things that they want to do every day so they don't have to follow all the steps every time. There's also visual impairments that can range from color blindness or glasses to complete blindness. And so folks who experience some kind of visual impairment may need to use increased text size, a braille keyboard, or talkback on your phone. And then also deaf and hard of hearing, which can range from minor to complete deafness. And so these folks might use closed captioning, live transcription, or live captioning to interact with your app and the world around them. If you open your accessibility settings on your Android device, you'll find even larger range of options that these folks might be using beyond just these couple of that I've mentioned for each type of disability. So what are the web content accessibility guidelines and why do they matter for mobile? So the web content accessibility guidelines are a set of guidelines that are meant to improve web accessibility, and they're produced by the World Wide Web Consortium. The most recent version came out in 2018. It was the first one that had some type of mobile guidelines. There are 3 tiers that we care about, A, AA, and AAA. So level A is the most basic level of accessibility. AA tries to address the biggest and most common forms of barriers for folks with disabilities trying to use the web. And AAA is significant but complex, often complex improvements to the web. In most cases, we aim for AA across the board in mobile and web. And AAA is not always possible to reach every time. But it's important to note that reaching AA does not mean you should stop. You can always continue to work up that chain, even if you can't get all the way to AAA standards. You might wonder why the World Wide Web Consortium matters for mobile. And one of their principles is that they actually built out principles and didn't give guidelines for specific frameworks. And so these guidelines can be taken and applied across technologies. And so they can be applied across technologies, including mobile. And the principles that are included are that your app, whether on web or mobile, should be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So what does this mean in mobile? So the things that we'll talk about in mobile that kind of get you to that AA standard are your touch target size, the color contrast of your app, your use of labels. So there are some accessibility APIs from Google that you can use for specific use cases, and the text size of your app. These are the most common barriers inside mobile apps, and so those are the things that we'll go over and how we implement those inside Android. So I wrote a very simple mobile app to demonstrate this that's available on my GitHub. So my GitHub username is Sierra O'Brien, and I have a repository pinned at the top for examples. And this is in a folder, Women Who Code Accessibility. Over the weekend, over this coming weekend, I'll add more examples that demonstrates some of the other things that didn't quite make it into that app because it's a really simple app. We actually won't do very much coding during this presentation. And that's one of the great things about Google is that they made it really easy to add accessibility to your app. And so we'll just really talk over a couple different examples and some of the best practices around those. And so there's actually not a lot of code between the starting branch and the final branch. So before we get started, I just want to get everyone on the same page and we'll talk about the app that we use. If you've heard me talk before, this is a really common app that I use for almost all of them. And it's just going out to GitHub and using the GitHub API to pull commits. So a quick video demo of the app that we'll be talking about. We have a username and a repository name. It can fetch those commits and it puts them in a recycler view. And so that's just an app that I have on my GitHub. There's also a refresh button at the bottom. It's really hard to see it when it's hit in this video because it refreshes very quickly, but it just does the same thing basically as fetch commits, and a clear button that clears out all the fields. And so I've included a screenshot version of that if the video moved too quick. So we have a text view and an edit text for both the username and the repository name, a clear button, a fetch commit button that makes the network call and display commits in a recycler view, and then the refresh button in the bottom right hand side. Oh, it's going to play it again. So in true T test-driven development, we're going to talk about how to test our app first and then go into how we make the fixes. That's my friend texting me about this talk I'm giving right now. So we'll talk about how to test our app for accessibility because we need to be able to find the mistakes before we're able to actually fix them. Until you get used to some of the very common pitfalls, it's a lot easier for some of these different things to work together to help you find the places that you're missing. So the first thing that on our list of ways to test for accessibility is the most important, and that's both manual testing by yourself and also user testing. So manual testing is when you yourself go through your app and try to operate it with some of these accessibility tools. A really good way to see if your app works is for you yourself to try to navigate it without watching it, without looking at it, without being able to hear it, and see if you can find out the information that you need from it. If someone from Domino's would have done that, that would have saved them a lawsuit. The second way is user testing. It's really similar to what we think about when we talk about user experience testing, is get the folks that actually use your app to come and tell you where they're struggling so that you can fix those problems. In addition, there are a lot of analysis tools that also can help you that are already implemented inside the Android framework. So you have link checks that automatically check some of the accessibility settings, particularly in like your XML, and we'll look at some of those. There's also a UI automator viewer that can look at your UI and tell you and can help you a lot with debugging where your bugs are in the UI. With automated testing, you can add the accessibility checks directly into your UI test so that it checks it automatically. And we'll look at an example of that later. And finally, there's the accessibility scanner, which is an app that you can download and it will scan over your app. This is what we'll be using tonight to look at through my example app, but it's also really important because you don't need to be technical to be able to use it, and you can use it on any app on your phone. So how do you use the accessibility scanner? So first off, it's an app on the App Store, and so it's by Google, and so you can just go out to the Play Store and download it to your app. So once installed, then you can go to your accessibility menu inside your settings menu, and you'll see an accessibility tab. And at the top in that center screenshot, you see that the accessibility scanner is one of the downloaded apps for accessibility. So once you click into the accessibility scanner, all you have to do is turn it on. When you turn it on, it'll ask for a series of permissions that you'll just have to grant it. and then so that it can draw all over your screen and interact with other apps on your phone. So what does the accessibility scanner actually do? So this is a quick demo of using the accessibility scanner on top of my app. So you see the blue check mark. So I have already started the accessibility scanner and I'm sitting inside my app. And so when you open that, you can either record or you can do a snapshot. So in this case, I chose to do a snapshot. And so it starts preparing your results and then it pulls up where it finds flags mistakes. And so in this case, I have 5 suggestions on my to edit text, my button, and my refresh button. And so if I click onto that, I can actually see what that suggestion is. So in this case, it says touch target, and it says consider making this biggable. And then it also has a learn more. And so I can go into my support and read about the implementation and design and the testing for this particular feature. And then I can go through each one and check what is wrong with each one of those. And so I see my clear button also has a touch target issue. And I see that my refresh button has an item label missing and a touch target. So it's important to remember that all of these tools that we talked about for testing need to work together to really find all the mistakes in your app to make it a robust experience. The accessibility is a great tool, but it is not perfect. And so we'll talk about a couple of the pitfalls that you have to watch out for. So these are all 3 different screenshots of my app in 3 different states, and we see different suggestions on each one. So on my first one, this is a state that we just scanned and looked at, and so I have 5 suggestions that we just talked about. In the middle, I have now up to 7 suggestions because I've cleared out my username and repository. And so I have the same 4 elements highlighted, but I got 2 extra improvements for accessibility. And on the right-hand side, I also have 7 suggestions, but now I've picked up a couple new elements that have been flagged. So in all 3 cases, I flagged the same 5. So I flagged that my touch target is wrong for both my edit text. I've tagged that my clear button has a small text touch target, and that my refresh button is missing its label and it has a touch target. So in the middle one, it's also picked up that now that username and repository don't have their labels. It doesn't see this when my text is already there because it reads that text. And so that accounts for those extra 2. And then on the far right, it's now picked up the fetch button. In this case, this is the only one that actually has a tiny bit of different code. And in that case, I actually set the background color to the background color that it was in the first screen. But in the first screen, it was just the default implementation of the button from Google. And so I have this light purple text on this dark purple background, but the contrast between those isn't the same. And so that's one example of something that it didn't pick up and should have picked up when I was using the default implementation. So, and then also on that final one, now that I don't have anything to read in my list, it no longer knows how to read that element for the user, and it'll just have an empty view there. One important thing to note is that it can only read things on the screen. In the video, at the very beginning, you saw there was actually a progress bar. So none of these states are actually testing when that progress bar is visible. And so that's one of those things you need to watch out for, is that you not only need to fix the elements in your most common state, right? My first screen is the most common state that I'm going to see this app in, but I need to make sure that I test a variety of states that my app could be in to make sure that no matter where the user is, it's still accessible and robust. In addition to remembering that all these can work together, the lint does actually always pick up that those 2 edit texts need that missing accessibility label. And so looking at my XML and looking at that scanner can pull both of those together at the same time. So the most important thing that we need to think about when we're doing accessibility is consistency. Your app needs to act the way that the accessibility framework is expecting it to act. This is one of those things that rolls back to building accessible apps is better for everyone. When you think about people who have iPhones or have Android devices, we expect those UIs and the apps on those Play stores to act the way that we expect them to act. One example of this that really, really annoys me personally is that the Uber app on iPhone really looks like an Android device, and it doesn't look the way that I expect it to look for an iOS phone. So consistency is really good because it means that the accessibility tools will act the way that they're supposed to act, but it also gives your regular users the consistency that they also expect. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to work on is the touch targets. So touch targets, the recommended size for each of these interactive UI elements is 48 pixels by 48 pixels. This does not mean that the UI's visible area must be 48 by 48, only that the area around it in total will add up to 48, 48. And so this can be achieved by using your padding and the height and width, and whether you use min height and min width or regular height or regular width. So the end goal is to have padding on your top, your height element, and your bottom to all add up to greater than or equal to 40, and similar with your left and right. If you aren't familiar with min height, all it does is really add padding automatically. So on my left-hand side, I have a clear button without setting a min height. And so I see that the background color that I've added to demonstrate that touch target area is wrapped tightly around my text. Whereas my right-hand side, I have my clear button and I've actually added the min height. And so you see it stretches it out. So what does this look like in our code? And how do we fix those two elements? So for my edit text, and both my edit text and my clear button, I chose to use min height. And so all I had to do was leave my layout width equal to 0. And since I'm using constraint layout, it takes up the whole space. And then I can set my min height to 48 and then leave layout height to wrap content. If you're wondering why we would use min height and still set my layout height, it's so that if your app is in a different language, or if your text size changes and that ends up needing to wrap around, that layout height equal to wrap content will stretch out to make your text have room to fit. Whereas if you set it to an exact height, it will try to center it in the middle, and the top and bottoms of that text might get cut off. And so all of those are now fixed. For my bottom button, I have this image view, and it was previously set to 40 by 40 dp. And so in this case, I wanted to stay the same. I wanted the image itself to stay looking the exact same. And so I can set my height and width equal exactly to 48, and then add that padding right around it to shrink the image itself back down to 40 by 40. But the overall touch target area is now 48 by 48. This also helps users like me who might get really frustrated if I try to touch a really small button and I can't do it on the first try and try to click a bunch. That's really irritating to all users. And so this is an example of something that's better for everyone if we make it accessible. So now when we scan this app, the only things that's actually left in this perfect ideal state is that my button is missing that one label. So this fixed a lot of our problems. Although we went over some of the other ones that we know are also possible problems. So another thing on our list was color contrast. So AA compliance means that your color contrast needs to be at least 4.5 to 1 for regular text and 3 to 1 for large text. So by changing the text color of my fetch commits button text from that light purple to white, I go from 2.87, which is not AA compliant, to 7.62 to 1, which is AA compliant. So there are a lot of tools online to help you check your color scheme to make sure that things are meeting that requirement. For designers out there, you might wonder, how do you meet those requirements and also stick to your theme at the same time? And Google has, with their design system, Material Design, has developed a material color palette that can help you pick your colors. And so when you insert your primary color, it will give you the whole range of colors that go with that single color. And so you'll get your primary color at some material color, and then it'll have the lighter versions of that and the darker versions of that, so you can pick and choose which ones you need. In this particular example, I could have picked the very lightest version of this purple color family and the darker purple in the color family, and I could have made my button, if I really wanted to, I could make my button dark purple with that really light purple and still meet the color contrast accessibility guidelines. So one of the most important things, and what we'll spend most of the rest of our time talking about, is how to add labels to buttons. And so the basics of adding labels is that it needs to describe each UI element and describe their purpose. In Android, we do this by adding a content description to our UI elements. Not every element needs a content description. For example, a text view automatically reads the text inside the text view. And also a text button will automatically read the text in the button. And so it's not necessary to go through and add it to everything. This is one of those things that Google has done to make your life a little easier. So some of the best practices for building out these labels and hints is to use the right UI element. Don't include the UI element in the description. So if I have a button, I don't need to include the word button on the end, because Google will automatically do that. So for my fetch commit buttons, we'll see on the next slide that will be read back with talkback as fetch commits button, and the content description itself would just be fetch commits. Each description should be unique so that your user doesn't get confused when you have multiple elements with the same name on the same screen of where they are on that screen. And you should skip over decorative effects. So like if you have a divider line or a gradient or something in the background that doesn't actually do anything or is not necessary to understand the context of the screen, you can skip over those decorative effects by adding an @null into the content description, or we'll see later you can do important for accessibility equals false. Other things to think about is that your content descriptions and labels need to be localized so that it's not accessible only in one language, right? Back to Google's initial mission, we want to make it accessible worldwide. They should be concise because someone has to sit there and listen through all those content descriptions. They should be descriptive so they know what's actually happening. So using the right element. So on my screen, I have 3 different elements that are technically clicking a button. I have this clear button, I have fetch commits, and I have a refresh button in the corner. And so when I actually built this out, I used a text view, actually a button, in an image view the first time. While I didn't do the extra work, it's really easy to style things in Androids to make them look like something else. It's really easy to make a text view, add a background, put some elevation on it, and call it a button. We don't want to do that for reasons that we just talked about, is that you get some free things when you use the right UI element. TalkBack is smart enough to know that when something has an on-click listener, it will read it as an action. And so even though I used a text view, it would tell me that I can double click to activate. So when I switch that text view over to the button, which is a better choice, I get a lot of things for free beyond just that accessibility content. I also get the accent color. It puts it in all caps. It matches the touch target size for accessibility, and it increases the elevation so that it looks nice and looks like you can press it, which is all really nice things, and why following the right UI element is a good choice. And additionally, I can switch out that image view for a image button and get the same things. Now it knows that to add the word button. While we don't have time to go into custom lint rules. This could be a really good thing to write a custom lint rule for, so that you get some more extra accessibility things. It's like if you add an on-click listener to a text view, maybe it tells you, hey, maybe you can switch this back to a button. You put an on-click listener on an image view, hey, maybe this should be an image button. So for my edit text, I need to add a hint to it, and there's two ways to do this. I can either add a label for the text view, and that text label for will use the edit text elements ID, and then it takes that same text view, and it automatically builds the content label for my edit text. Or I can add the hint attribute right into the edit text. The differences between these two are that if I do label for, when my UI is empty, when I clear out those two fields, that edit text will be empty. And if I add the hint for, then it will automatically add that repository word to the edit text hint itself. And so that's a decision that you'll have to make as a designer and developer of which one's a better choice for your UI. In addition, we can do a lot to group layers. So we have a group labels. So we had a recycler view in our app. And so out of the box, Talkback will read each recycler view as one continuous element. And so in my case, it would read out that commit message, it would read out the author name, and it would read out the date as one breath. And then it would also tell me where I am in that list. So in my case, for the first one, it'd say 1 out of 30. In this case, it's a pretty simple recycler view, so it's totally fine that it reads it as 1 because there's nothing else that I need focus on inside. That's not always going to be the case. And so if you needed to read a specific element, you can add this screen reader focusable true with that 1 next to it. And then it will read all the other elements, and then you'll be able to swipe through to hit that text view. This is something you'd want to do. You have like a button inside your recycler view, or more than one button inside your recycler view, so they can actually interact with those buttons. Other ways for grouping is if I had something that I wanted to read all together that wasn't a recycler view, then I can add that screen reader focusable to the top layer layout element, and then put focusable false on the inside ones. And so if this wasn't a recycler view, but I thought that the commit message and the author should always go together, then this would read as one single UI element, and I wouldn't be able to focus individually on the message and the author. Oh, I missed one. And then sometimes you might want to read the container itself and the elements. For example, if you had some kind of grid view, and you might want to read that this column is day 1, the second column is day 2, the third column is day 3, so they can skip over the entire column if they want. And so in that case, I can put that screen reader focusable equals true and not put the focusable false onside the individual UI elements, because they want to be able to access both the full container and then also the list inside. Google also offers some really helpful classes to help you make sure that it reads it the right way. So a TTS span is a special type of span that can pass in context so that it knows how to read that particular element. This information can help text-to-speech correctly pronounce a text element. The best example of this is if you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Without wrapping that in a TTS span to add some context, it would read as 123,456,789. If I pass it in a TTS span type of type digit, then it will read this out as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This can be really great for doing things like a address where you have a zip code at the end. Otherwise, my address in Ohio would be read as 45,044. In addition, we talked a little bit about these accessibility actions that we can add to our views. So it can only read things on the screen, and they can only interact with those elements as they touch it. And so you have things like swipe to delete for emails. And so for that case, you can add this accessibility action straight to that view, and so that the accessibility helper can know that that extra action is also there. There are helpers for also spans with links, so that if you have a text span that has a link inside of it, it knows to swipe through those and tell your user that that is a clickable link. Sometimes we build custom views for like an action dialogue that pops up because the dialogue modal itself doesn't quite fit your needs. And so for that, you can add this accessibility pane title so that when your custom view pops up, it can still add the extra context. So this is an alert, treat it like an alert, and then read through your elements. Finally, you will also want to think about some different displays. So we should start out with my normal display, but some folks might need to increase their text size. This could be me after I go to the eye doctor and my eyes are dilated. So in my case, I have a recycler view, and so it's always swipeable. This is also a really good design principle and a really good practice to get into because there are a lot of different sizes of Android phones. And so by making sure that I can expand my text on a normal size phone, it also tells me what it's going to look like on a smaller phone. And so you can fit both for large text sizes and small screen sizes at the same time. And finally, as developers, we know that a lot of folks like dark mode. Dark mode is actually an accessibility feature. And so making sure that your app looks good in dark mode is not only helpful for users who like to use dark mode, but also helps the accessibility of your app. To check the espresso test, you just have to use the automated testing like espresso test, you just have to add initiation of checking of accessibility checks.enable. And then every time that espresso hits a UI element in its test, it will immediately check for accessibility settings. And it will check really similar things to what we've gone over. So it will check for contrast, and it will check for context, missing and incorrect labels, small touch targets, and other implementation issues with accessibility features. Similarly, in roboto test, you can add the at accessibility checks annotation to do a similar thing. So we only touched on a few really minor things. There are a lot of other things that you can think about when you're trying to build an accessible app. For example, if you're using custom views, you need to think about how to implement those accessibility APIs into your custom view. One really good practice for this is making sure that you always use or always try to extend one of the view types that Google has already implemented, because then again, you get all those accessibility features for free. We didn't talk anything about video and media, but there's lots of other things that need to be accessible. Google's made this a lot easier with live transcribe and live caption, but when you play videos in your app, you should think about, can they rewind? Can you skip this? Is this going to hurt anyone's experience in your app? So what's next? So the web content guidelines are set to be updated in 2021. So what does this mean for mobile? We're hoping that this means that there will be more mobile guidelines. As we move to a mobile-first world, it's important to have better guidelines for mobile as well as web. And then we talked a lot about XML and adding these things to your XML directly into your layout. And as Android developers, we know we're moving towards Jetpack Compose. And so what does this mean for Android accessibility? And I don't know. With Google's commitment to accessibility and building this really robust accessibility framework, I hope that we see like continued work forward with that inside Jetpack Compose as well. So that wraps up my presentation. You can follow me on Twitter for the occasional funny Android joke. And if you want to talk to me or reach out to me, the best way to reach me is on the Women Who Code Mobile Slack. And so I think this QR code will take you there, although you're never sure.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sierra. Thank you so much for your talk. You have a lot of conversation in the chat. I didn't know if you wanted to read through that. We do have our next session starting in a few minutes. So I didn't know if you wanted to do a quick Q&A with the audience now, or if you wanted to just have them reach out to you directly for any questions.
I can do a quick Q&A. I closed the chat though, because it makes me nervous. So I haven't seen any of these.
Yeah, no worries. You can definitely hang out and answer any questions here, and I will let you have that I have the floor to answer any questions here, and I'm going to go ahead and hop off to start the next sessions. But thank you so much for your talk, and thank you so much to everyone who attended.
Do I need to go start the other session?
No, I think Shauna has it covered for you now.
Okay,
so you can stick around here and hang out.
Okay.
And answer questions. All right, thanks, Sierra.
Thanks. I'm reading through everyone's question. I meant to put together a list of iOS tools, but I just ran out of time. Kay, I can send you this presentation if you want. I was going to post it on the Women Who Code mobile Slack. Like I said, that's the quickest way to get a hold of me. And since I'm afraid that they might have ruined my link by having the links here, but that's a quick and easy way to reach out to me, and I can send you these slides and you can get all those clickable links because they are there. So I used a lot of talkback while I was working on putting together this presentation. I noticed a comment about how frustrating it can be. And one, it can be very frustrating for your first time. But at my first role, my first job in my first role was implementing accessibility at a bank. And so I remember about 6 years ago using it for the first time. And using it this time was a really pleasant surprise because I thought that it had come a really long way. And you weren't forced to only swipe to navigate, and it had some extra features to be able to click on individual elements to move quicker. What do you use to test Ally on an emulator? That is a really good question that I don't know that I have ever tried to do. I assume that you can also get the accessibility scanner, and also, right, all those automated tests can be used on an emulator. The only problem with relying aggressively on automated tests is that it requires you to have written really good coverage on your automated test, or else it's only going to test the parts that you have written those automated tests for, which is really the same problem with the accessibility scanner, is that if you don't hit those screens that you don't, or states that you don't often hit, you still can miss those critical parts of the app that people do actually use. So adding that accessibility test to a RoboElectric or espresso test can be a really good way to do it on any phone all the time. Diane said you can download the TalkBack API to test on an emulator. If I'm a software developer with an emphasis on web development, if you want to switch to Android, what is the easiest way to do it? Join the Women Who Code mobile Slack. I think that Google has a lot of really good code labs if you're interested in getting started. And so that is what I would recommend. I also just really recommend joining the Women Who Code Slack. There are a lot of really good tutorials that I can send you, Karen, if you're interested. There's some people on Twitter that make a lot of tutorials that I really like, and people that I think are on who do really good work. In addition, I have a couple of links for getting started. This year, during what should have been Google I/O, they also released a whole course on getting started with Android from Google, and I know some folks who have gone through that. Udacity also has a nano degree program and has a couple different free courses that I think have been really good, and they do a good job at keeping it up to date with the latest trends. So those are some of the places that I would get started. My recommendation for designers and developers to work together on a more accessible project. So I think that it's important to both be familiar with the guidelines because it takes both sides of it. There are some things that you can do as a developer without ever talking to QA. I think about that a lot with like the buttons. They can give me an icon, a button icon, because that's pretty similar, you see that pretty often in mobile. And I can just add that padding without ever talking to a designer about it at all. I can just make that a little bit bigger of a touch. And so that's across the board, is I can almost always have the padding that I need to make it meet those requirements. Doing the XML and using the right elements is also something that I can do as a developer and never have to talk to a designer. And so it really just comes down to extra features, is that they need to understand also that what the accessibility guidelines are. And then it becomes a conversation. How can I support you? And how, you calling them out to be like, hey, maybe this color contrast doesn't look like it's accessible. Is there something different we can use? Here's the material design palette. You can pick a darker version of the exact same color. That is what it's there to do, is give you that whole range of colors to help you meet lighter and darker needs based on your material design theme. I think that was all the questions. So like I said, you can reach out to me all the time. We run Android office hours on Slack, and we have a bunch of events coming up in December. So I'm really excited for both of those, and I hope that you reach out, and I look forward to meeting all of you more officially. So I think there's another round of talks going on, and so I hope to see you in some of those. Have a great night, day, morning, afternoon.